So being the most in-depth and competitive mode in Smite that gets most of the development focus, Conquest has undergone countless changes throughout the years to the point where parts of it are barely recognisable, while some remain basically the same. Today we're going to talk about these changes and how things were in past years and seasons of Smite. I personally have only been playing since open beta, so anything prior to that in closed beta or alpha Smite will be purely just from research. So any of you who did play all the way back then, be sure to leave your own thoughts and experiences below. And one final thing before we jump in. Some of the footage and map images I'll be using will likely be fairly low quality, so just bear with me. It's very hard to find images and videos from alpha and closed beta Smite that are high quality nowadays, but with that said, let's get into it. Okay, so the logical place to start with this will probably be Smite's alpha, though not much is really known about exactly what the map was like back then. I couldn't find a map image from alpha Smite, whether that's because there was an NDA on gameplay from that time or just no one recorded anything, I don't know. But I do know that it was a closed alpha and wasn't open to the public at that time. But we do get a decent look at some of the map in-game in some of these videos on screen now from various showcases Hi-Rez did about Smite in the alpha days, often at PAX events. The entire aesthetic of the map was completely different, and the fire giant was the Kraken back then also, along with some other cool tidbits like Ra walking instead of hovering, pre-rework Kali, and the original Alquang in action. If you have any secret info about Smite's alpha, then go ahead and leave it down below. So moving on from alpha, purely because there's nothing concrete to go on, closed beta is where we really started getting a good look at what the Conquest map had to offer, with some actual map images and full gameplays still floating around the internet of this time. So this is one of the first iterations of the Conquest map I could find. This is a screenshot from a gameplay video, so as I mentioned, sorry for the bad quality. But this image alone tells us so much about how Conquest was back in the early days of closed beta Smite. The most apparent things most of you probably recognise immediately are these here, the side jungles. As of recording, these have never made a return after being removed from Conquest during closed beta, and Hi-Rez have made no hints of them ever returning. So these sections of the jungle were basically just attached to the sides of each lane, duo and solo, and provided extra space to store buffs and XP camps. They could be accessed either by running straight through the lane on entrances within the lane itself, or by moving behind the tier 1 towers, and at this point in time house the red buff here, and two other buffs which will be unknown to most of you probably. The yellow and green buffs shown here were the armor and health buffs respectively. These were all buffs that existed back then but were removed. Armor, or defense buff as some called it, simply gave you 50 protections of each kind for free. Yeah, naturally this was mega broken early on in the game, especially when you add to the fact that you could stack multiple different buffs onto yourself at this time. So on top of your speed buff as a jungler, you could have this and a red buff or some other combination. It was pretty wild. And the green buff here was the health or regen buff, which gave 10 health per second in regen, equivalent to 50 HP 5 in today's metrics. The jungle at this time was much more gloomy and dark than modern day Smite, with plenty of grass, vines and other foliage obscuring views, and just in general had a more eerie feeling to it. Also, the ever-present mid-camps you've probably known the entire time you've played Smite didn't exist back in this version of Conquest. The camp attached to each side of the mid lane at this time was actually the cooldown buff, which gave 10% cooldown reduction to the wielder. If that sounds familiar, it should, because this buff was eventually removed and merged into the blue mana buff, which at the time only gave mana regen. In fact, all kinds of XP or harpy camps didn't exist in this version at all. Every camp on the map at this time was tied to some kind of buff. The three mainstay buffs of red, blue and speed, plus the extra 3 of cooldown, armor and health. Mostly from what I've seen of the meta at this time, it was a 2-1-2 meta rather than like a 2-1-1 jungler that we see in modern day Smite and in most MOBAs. The jungle was also much more dense with tight corridors in this version of the map, which made it more estranged from the lanes. And that combined with the fog and moss and the twisted trees seemed to give this version of the map a more spooky and eerie feel compared to the very fantasy driven aesthetic of later iterations on the map, especially with the Season 5 release. Speaking of, let's move on to the next version of the Conquest map, which was introduced in early open beta at the start of 2013, and stood for most of the beta with a few changes here and there. So this was sort of the start of that move towards a fantasy-esque appearance for the Conquest map. This version was certainly a lot more colourful with plenty of brighter greens in the jungle and lots of warm reds as well. In terms of strategy changes, this was one of the largest overhauls the Smite map has ever had. The side jungles along with the health and armor buffs were all removed, making the map look much more like a modern day Conquest with just the 3 lanes and the 2 jungle areas in between. The cooldown buff however remained at this point, and it was a sort of the counterpart to the blue mana buff. Each side lane had one or the other, which was probably pretty interesting. As it is right now, Hi-Rez aim to have 0 differences between playing as either Chaos or Order on each side of the map, but back in this iteration it actually mattered a lot. Since if you're playing Order side, your duo lane had a mana buff, while the enemy's duo lane had a cooldown buff, and the opposite for solo lane. Order side had a cooldown buff for solo laners, and Chaos side had the solo mana buff. This is definitely something that wouldn't fly nowadays. Basically being screwed over on a coin flip for which buff you have access to in lane will be screamed out of the door faster than rituals were. This iteration of the map was also the first time we saw the generic Harpy XP camps, since prior to this all jungle camps gave buffs of some kind. These camps were introduced similarly to how they had been throughout Conquest history at the back of the map, though the geography and the terrain around them was definitely very different to how we see now. However, mid camps were still not a thing yet, but what used to be the cooldown buff attached to the side of the mid lane became the red buff in this update, giving mid laners very easy access to their red buffs, but also allowing plenty of steal and invade attempts. I imagine Agni was a horror to deal with, bombing your red buff over the mid lane wall and stealing it at this time. As far as I've gathered, the meta at this time was still that of a 2-1-2 comp rather than having a dedicated jungler, but around mid-2013 was when people started experimenting and running a typical Smite comp with an active jungler on the map. Also around the same time, mid camps were introduced in mid-2013, and red buff was moved backwards to the position it holds today. Not sure if the introduction of mid camps sparked the need for a jungler or if people just kinda eased into it, but yeah. Mid-camps were added around June 2013 in closed beta. This was also the same patch that merged the cooldown and mana buffs together, meaning each side lane had their own blue buff now instead of depending on whether you were Chaos or Order. Around August 2013, in patch 0.1.1682 of open beta, the Conquest map got a large visual overhaul to a completely new art style. As far as I'm aware, nothing was actually changed in terms of layout, buffs, or how the map plays in this update. This was purely a visual change which took the map into a much more Roman/Greek theme, with generally more cold colours compared to the warm reds and oranges of the previous map's aesthetic. This version of the Conquest map was basically the version I started playing the game with, so there's a lot of nostalgia here for me. I started playing in early 2014, around the time of Geb's release for anyone who's curious, so basically from here on out I have personal experience with the map, though a majority of the big sweeping changes like side jungles and old buffs were phased out in the closed beta or the start of open beta. This map was really the first iteration of the standardized map we have today, and it remained basically unchanged through the rest of closed beta and season 1. With the advent of season 2, however, another large visual overhaul came to the Conquest map, along with a few gameplay changes as well. The most notable gameplay change made at the start of this season will definitely be the introduction of the purple buff to duo lane, replacing the mana buff that had been there previously. When first introduced, this purple buff gave attack speed and basic attack power, and it was aimed squarely at those hunters, almost being a mini hunter's blessing of sorts. Along with this, they also moved red in speed so that they would always be on the same side of the map for both teams now, where before your buff's location was dependent on whether you were Chaos or Order. There was also some shuffling around of various terrain and rocks to make the jungle a little easier to navigate in this update. So the next big and very controversial changes to the Conquest map happened at the beginning of Season 3. And I have to say, I had nearly purged these memories from my system and forgot this happened. So purple buff was removed entirely, that being the attack speed purple buff, and was replaced by bot XP camps, which was basically a second set of back camps for dual lane specifically. Speed buff was also removed, in quotes. The actual camp itself was gone, with blue buff moving into its place, and where blue was before being replaced with those same XP camps we saw in dual lane, meaning both side lanes now had access to these small XP camps. Red buff did remain untouched. So I mentioned speed was removed in quotes. It wasn't totally removed, it was moved to 3 speed elementals located by Fire Giant, each of which dropped a mini speed buff equivalent to a third of a regular speed buff, so you needed to claim all 3 to get a regular strength speed buff. Issue was, there was only one set of these elementals and they were in a neutral location, meaning junglers had to fight to get them and would often not get all 3 for that full speed buff effect. This seems just totally whack in today's climate, but back in the end of Season 2, people were ranting and raving about how OP speed buff was, and this was the change they came up with. As you know, this didn't last very long though, and we were swiftly back to a regular speed buff system in patch 3.8, which was Susano's release patch by the way, where they moved the blue buff back to its normal place next to solo, deleted the Boar XP camp that was there, and put speed buff back where blue was. The fire elementals of course lost their speed buff capabilities and simply became an XP and gold camp taken mostly by jungle or solo. So with Season 4, not much really changed in relation to the Conquest map, aside from the addition of the Gold Fury Oracles and the Portal Demon. The Portal Demon, for those who only started playing recently after Season 5, was the predecessor to the Pyromancer, and would create a portal between Fire Giant and your base when it was killed. Other than these 2 additions, for the most part Season 4 brought very little in terms of changes, which was probably part of the reason for the very stale meta we had in Season 4. Season 5 brought of course the huge visual overhaul to the map, taking it truly into the fantasy direction, and this visual design is the one we still hold today as of Season 6. Along with the visual overhaul, the Portal Demon was reworked into the Pyromancer we now know, and the entire layout of the jungle was shifted to give it a more close-in feel with more winding pathways, as opposed to the very open jungle we'd had for the past couple of seasons. Season 6 didn't change all too much for Conquest as it was deemed in a pretty good state. However, the new Gold Furies, Primal and Oni were added along with the Solar Lane Totem of Ku, of course. So that's it for the Conquest map over the years. This one took quite a lot of research and time, especially for the early days of beta and alpha, so if you did enjoy this and found this entertaining, then drop me a rating and subscribe for more videos just like this every week here on the channel. And I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace out, you nerds.